Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Trials at Home webinar on digital literacy in decentralized clinical trials. What is asked of trial participants? Short disclaimer. So today we'll be talking about participant diversity. So we will first start with, I will first start with introducing ourselves. Then we'll talk a little bit about trials at home and participant diversity. And then we actually have a case study or a good example on how we research participant diversity and decentralized clinical trials in the Trials at Home consortium. So first, who are we? Well, today Parla will do the most of the talking. She is a former master student at the University Medical Center in Utrecht, and she now works as an operational specialist at Deep Measures. And Parla did her research project in our group at the University Medical Center in Utrecht, and but now moved on with her career because she graduated. My name is Bart Lagewaard. I'm an assistant professor at the University Medical Center in Utrecht. And as part of my daily job, I also do the scientific coordination of Radial. And I will get back to Radial very shortly in this presentation, but it's a clinical trial that we are executing as the Trials at Home consortium. Who's also on the slides, but is actually is not presenting today, is Mira. She's an associate professor also at the University Medical Center in Utrecht, and she's the academic lead in Trials at Home. Yeah, she's also heavily involved in this project, so that's why she's explicitly mentioned. And another explicit mention is for the Trials at Home consortium, because also this research is everybody, not everybody, but many consortium members contributed to this research. And therefore, I also wanted to mention that explicitly. So I already mentioned the Trials at Home project. Probably if you found this webinar, maybe you know already what we are about, but actually we are all about decentralized clinical trials. So we aim to provide recommendations and drive the adoption of the decentralized clinical trials in Europe. We are a big public-private consortium with pharma companies, academic institutes, small businesses, patient organizations, and we do everything decentralized clinical trials. But today, we will be talking especially about what Trials at Home does around participant diversity. So I start with a little bit of a bit of a controversial statement, but I think that if you sign up for this webinar, maybe you agree with me, is that conventional trials often fail to include a diverse participant population. And then I have a reference there that refers to an article that talks about the inclusion of different races of people in clinical trials and how that does not necessarily reflect the population that ends up taking a drug. But I also have this other reference there that it's not only about race. There's many aspects of diversity, and there was a small consortium that identified underserved groups, as we like to talk about it, that are not so well represented in clinical trials. And actually, from those underserved groups, you can deduct some diversity aspects, as you can say. And then another controversial statement I put here on the slide is decentralized clinical trials are more diverse, or they allow for a more diverse participant population. And then I have 3 points there, because actually the reference behind this is a question mark, because the promises might be high, but the evidence is actually quite low. And as part of Trials at Home, we think it's important to understand what is the effect of a decentralized approach on participant diversity, so that we can, in the future, have recommendations for decentralized clinical trials that are more diverse. But before that, we need to understand what is actually the effect. So why are there promises for decentralized clinical trials and increasing diversity? I think many of those revolve around accessibility. So you're not restricted to your going to a research center or your geographical location, but also patient centricity. It's easier to fit a trial in your life, probably. But there might be other promises there. I think, for example, it can also work that it might be some more anonymous or a bit more private for diseases with a stigma, for example. Could also think about that. So there are many promises that you can think of. But again, the evidence is actually quite low, and there's not really a study that compared to different trial approaches and then what is the effect on the population. So far, I was going to say, because as I said, we think it's important to research that in trials at home, and we also take this concept along in the radial trial. So as a whole, the radial trial aims to assess the scientific and operational quality of decentralized clinical trials and hybrid clinical trials on various aspects. As you can see here, for example, we evaluate the acceptability of such a trial, but also on the right here, the potential benefits. And then one of those potential benefits could then be participant diversity. How will we do this? Well, in the radial trial, we have different trial arms, but in this sense, in this case, we're looking at the trial parts. So we have a site-based recruitment, which is sort of traditionally recruited trial population, but then also a remote or decentralized recruited trial population in part B. So the recruitment methods is different. And also, of course, how the participants experience the study is different, either being decentralized, hybrid, or conventional. But the activities that they have to perform are all similar. So in the end, we can make a comparison between those different recruitment methods on aspect of diversity. So there are, as I said, there are many things that we were comparing in this trial, not only participant diversity, but that's the focus of today. And in radial, we'll be comparing various aspects of diversity, such as socioeconomic status and digital literacy as well. And that's also the topic of today. As I said in the previous slide already, we have promises, there's evidence, but one might also think of certain challenges that a decentralized clinical trial design brings. And one of those challenges could be that a decentralized clinical trial might have higher requirements for digital literacy. And that is something that we were talking about today. And actually, that's something we talk about in the consortium all the time, which is, and actually this summer, we had the discussion in the consortium, what are we asking of our clinical, of our participants? And the PhD students in the project, they made a video to spark that discussion, so we can have an open discussion about these things. So we can think of what are we actually asking of participants, what are the requirements, and how many devices. But this is, of course, a funny video just to spark an important discussion to have around this trial approach. And along in those lines, Parla also did her research on digital literacy, because in order to understand actually it's important to understand what do we actually ask from participants, and that's where Parla's research comes in. I've already introduced Parla, so you can, if you would like to tell us about your study, Parla.
Yes, thank you. I think you can hear me already. Thank you, Bart. This was a very nice introduction, and maybe you already covered some of the background that I will be covering shortly right now. So I will be contributing to some of the work we did in Trials at Home regarding to digital literacy, and hopefully this will be a very nice use of your time along the way. I'm very excited. So yeah, let's start. So I will give you first a little background. So I will just briefly go over it. But of course, we are all part of we were all there in COVID-19 pandemic, and we know that the healthcare services were mainly carried out online during this time. What maybe not all of us might know is that there were some papers published from this period by some clinics. They were talking about the limited access of the vulnerable groups to the healthcare during this period. And the main problem there was the lack of access to technology and or low digital literacy. And these two combined is nowadays known as digital divide. This term was coined in 1995 first, and it was referring to disparities among the population in terms of access to technology, because it was difficult to have in the home, it was difficult to have access to. But once this became more common in households and was more available, cheaper, then the realization came that even if we have the technology, we might not always be able to use it to its full potential, which is referred here also as the digital literacy. So as Bart already mentioned, DCTs are a little bit in the spotlight, especially with COVID-19, because they potentially remove some of the barriers for our participants. And one good example to this is the travel burden that participants may have. However, we also face a challenge, and this is introducing novel challenges. And one of these is digital literacy requirements based on increased digital tool use. However, nowadays, at least right now, it is not very easy to make a conclusion out of it, because we don't know yet what exactly the digital skill requirements are for the DCTs. And therefore, it is difficult to make an assessment how these requirements may impact on the diversity. So from this background, we came with the question, what are the digital literacy competencies required from participants for effective participation in decentralized clinical trials? Let me revoke this, yes. So here we took two phrases, important phrases, digital literacy competencies and decentralized clinical trials, and basically pulled this question apart and looked into what do we know about these terms already. So when we look at digital competencies, we know that these are applicable only when a digital method is used. And secondly, tools with same purpose may have different competence requirements. For example, an example I can give is an activity tracker. There are many of these activity trackers, different brands, and not all of them are the same. I mean, there's hardware design difference, software design difference, which may make some of them less user-friendly, less intuitive. Maybe when you're starting up, it asks you confusing questions. However, maybe the other one is plug and play, and then you feel more comfortable. So these can change what is required from you, and hence the digital literacy you may need to use this tool. And when we look at decentralized clinical trials, we know that every clinical trial is unique. And in terms there are different measurement needs and there are different tool needs. Of course, this goes together. This is a bit maybe the obvious one, and less obvious ones, in my opinion, are decentralization is not equal to digitalization. So sometimes these can be referred somewhat interchangeable. However, decentralization can be achieved by non-digital means, for example, by sending a letter, visiting a patient's house. These are still decentralizing some of the activities, but they are not necessarily digital. And the latter one is decentralization is a continuum. And why I now want to say this is sometimes we regard decentralization as a yes-no question, but decentralization can be at different levels. For example, a clinical trial can recruit and do pre-screening online, but for measurements, you may need to visit a clinical trial, or this can happen in vice versa. So it doesn't mean when we say decentralized clinical trial, it doesn't imply that everything has to be digital and remote. But from this, summarizing all we know, we concluded that we cannot make one single list of digital competencies that is applicable for every clinical trial. So instead, we decided to look at centralized clinical trials and which components are more likely to be digitalized. And we identified 5 main components. These are online recruitment and screening, remote consent, telemedicine, trial applications, and remote measurement devices. And our objective has been, we had 2 objectives, and the first one was to identify the fundamental skills required for effective participation in DCTs. And here I mean a holistic view to DCTs. So these skills may not apply to every case, but more in like generalization. Secondly, we wanted to build separate lists for each components that we have identified that are comprehensive, so that this can behave more like a checklist rather than, okay, these are the skills, this is every case like this. No, this is more, we wanted to have a more modular approach to accommodate most of the clinical trials. To achieve our goals, we follow the 3-step approach. The first, we started with semi-structured interviews with some industry professionals that are focused on different steps of clinical trials. Then we proceeded to a Delphi study, which consisted of 3 rounds of survey and a panel meeting in the end. This is basically, we formed a Delphi panel. So this was a group of professionals, and then we did an offline survey that everybody could complete it on their own time in the given time frame. And lastly, with the results we achieved from 1 and 2, we mapped these onto the European Digital Competence Framework for Citizens. Maybe another important point I shouldn't forget to mention is the outcome of the semi-structured interviews were mainly the skills. And during these interviews, we identified skills for all these 5 categories. And we also looked, are there any other categories? And they weren't. And these feed into the Delphi study round 1, which I will show a diagram of later. I will now walk you through, trying to be quick about it, through our Delphi structure. So I mentioned that it was 3 rounds. So the bottom line is round 1, 2, 3. But on the x-axis, then you can see that section 1 and section 2. So for round 1, we had only 1 section. And we started with demographic questions. And then we, all the skills we gathered during the interviews, we grouped them under the relevant decentralized elements. And our participants had to rate these on a Likert scale 1 by 1. Once we gathered the results and analyzed this, we built the round 2, and round 2 was formed of 2 sections. So here we again used the 5 decentralized elements, but underneath now we structured the skills based on the round 1 outcomes under 4 main titles. The first to be skills that reach consensus, where participants didn't need to take any action, but it just to give a holistic view still to all the skills under this decentralized element. Second is skills that didn't reach consensus. And for these skills, we provided median score from the previous round and the summary of the comments we received per skill. And in the light of this information, we asked our participants to re-rate these skills. Third is the skills subject to changes in wording, and this was the changes were based on the comments collected during round 1. So maybe most of our participants felt like this doesn't reflect the points very well. We should drop this wording out and change. And this kind of comments we processed and made changes. And these were treated as if they are rated for the first time, as if they are new skills, and they were also given the previous version as well. And lastly, we had newly added skills. So we collected with 3 text boxes in the end of each section ideas on, is there anything else you would like to see here that you're missing? And then we analyzed these, and the ones that fit into the scope of this research, we added them to be rated for the first time in round 2. And in section 2, this is the section that feeds into actually what I told about the fundamental skill list. the holistic view towards the decentralized clinical trials. And here we listed all the skills from section 1 and removed the duplications, and also including the newly added skills as well. And we asked our participants to choose the 5 most important digital skills in their opinion. In round 3, we followed almost the same structure as round 3. The only difference was done in the section 2, where we left out the skills that wasn't chosen by any of the panel members in round 2, and we excluded the skills that reached consensus in round 2. And then from leftover, so around 1 to 10 votes, we asked our participants to choose again 5 most important skills. Of course, I'm talking about we asked rating, etc., and consensus. And now I'm gonna also talk about how we analyze this and how was it done. So the ratings were on a 5-point Likert scale from absolutely not required to absolutely required, with the addition of an I don't know option. And the reason why we opted for this was that clinical trials have many different parts, and not every professional in clinical trial is very aware or working in every part of clinical trial. Some people might be very focused on in the beginning more, some maybe in the analysis. So this may differ, and we did not want to people to be rating neutral because they don't know. And we also communicated this with our participants, saying, please do not use these interchangeably. If you're neutral, choose neutral. If you are not aware, please choose I don't know. This I don't know options were actually quite scarcely used in the end. And when we come to the consensus criteria, this was based on interquartile ranges in every skill. If the interquartile range was below 1.5, we accept it as it's reached a consensus. Then we can look at the median, and based on the score of the median, we categorize them. Okay, this is a critical skill or not critical skill or not required skill. And you can see here the median ranges that we gave. And if a skill was the interquartile range was equal or bigger than 1.5, we accept it as no consensus. And in the subsequent Delphi round, this skill was re-rated again. And this was for section 1. And in section 2, we had a 50% cutoff point. So if the 50% of the panel agreed that this is a critical skill, then we accepted these as reached a consensus. And in round 3, we applied the 50% cutoff point as well, but to give a bit more granularity, we also applied a 25% cutoff point. So just so that it's a little bit more elaborate list for everyone. So I hope this wasn't too long. Now I will move into the results and quickly into the discussion. So in our results, we did 6 semi-structured interviews, and I cannot read because of the Zoom, but some number of skills, which 34 of them are unique. And the difference between these numbers comes from these skills being sometimes repeated in different decentralized components. So a skill may apply more than one case. And we had 27 people invited for our Delphi afterwards. And in round 1, we had 25 participants completing our round 1. And then there are 14 more skills added, 11 of them unique, reaching us the total number of 56 skills. And in round 2 and 3, we had 23 participants completing the Delphi survey. So we lost 2 participants in that between round 1 and 2. And in the panel meeting, so we had only 2 skills to conclude that we didn't reach the consensus in round 3. So we discussed these, and we had 12 participants attending to this meeting. And we agreed in this meeting that one of the skills would split into two. Therefore, well, split into two, and one was rated as not required eventually. So we had one more skill added, reaching us the total number of 57 skills in the study. And if I show the demographics, well, we had a diverse group in our Delphi panel, majority being from the biopharmaceutical companies, but we also had tech vendors, academia, healthcare providers, CROs, and consultants. And we had some selection criteria based on experience, and our participants could choose multiple options from there based on their experience. The lowest experience was in developing technologies for DCTs, and this was 12 people from our panel, so almost 50%, a little bit less. And here you can see an example list from remote consent. So this is the short list, well, the list we created for remote consent as a result. And here you can see how the classification of skills are put in here. So critical skills, not critical skills, and not required skills. I will talk in a bit more about what these not required skills are, but to quickly go over, critical skills are more likely to be required. Not critical skills were more regarded as nice to have, but we shouldn't be asking them really, but likely that it happens. And not required skills were we shouldn't use tools that requires these skills to be used. And this is the list that we created for fundamental skills, so for DCT. So this is the section 2 results. And here you can see the first 6 is the 50% cutoff point is in the middle. First 4 of these came out of the round 2. There was a quick consensus between the participants. And after that, the latter 2 were added in the end of round 3 results, which is the reason why there is, if you look at the numbers, it looks like they are not ordered. But the difference is coming from there because the first 4 were distinctively the alignment in the group. These are really important. And the other important 2 was added afterwards. So we cannot exactly treat it maybe the same value, which is why they are marked with a star next to them. To continue on the discussion, these were some examples how it looked like the results. And now I would like to talk to you about the findings I have. So I mentioned that we mapped this according to this DIGCOM framework in the beginning. So this framework is published first in 2013. You can see this information on the right bubble. And they include 6 main competence areas for this exercise and 4 broad proficiency levels, describing how the knowledge is acquisition of knowledge, complexity of the tasks, and autonomy in completing the tasks. So based on this framework, when we mapped it, we saw that 3 main competence areas identified was device and software operations, which is accepted as like the basic operations in this framework, followed by information and data literacy and communication and collaboration. Overall, across the framework, we see that the required proficiency level is foundation. This is named like that in the framework, and foundation refers to the level 1 out of the 4. And this is mainly because participants are not expected to execute any of these skills without guidance from the clinical trial staff. So ideally, if they have questions, they can always come and ask. There will be a help desk. Therefore, or we would give them training how to use an application. Therefore, it is foundation. One exception to this is online recruitment and screening skills. And here the proficiency level may span from foundation to intermediate. A reason for that is in online recruitment and screening, we sometimes rely on participants to have online presence already and taking part in some online activities to come across our clinical trial. And if this is the case, this person has to have some level of autonomy to do things on their own. They might be getting help from their relatives, but we have to take into consideration that maybe they don't have someone to help them, and we rely on them being on their own, clicking a link, and then applying for further contact. And when we look at our fundamental skill list, actually we see a reflection of these results in what our participants told us through the survey and all the comments. So all the online recruitment and screening critical lists were listed in the fundamental digital skill list that we have constructed together. And other skills in this list were mostly referring to data integrity, the concerns about data integrity. And I mentioned the not required skills earlier, and I will now come back to that one. And here on the side is the skills that were rated not required. And I will now talk about a little bit why this happened. Like I mentioned, or actually didn't mention yet, all the skills were taken from real life examples or through our interviews with the professionals from their real experiences. So we know that at some point these skills were required in a clinical trial. So we weren't really expecting, I think, in the beginning to get such a result. And of course, with every skill, participants were given the option to leave comments, and we looked further, why is this, and did some research in it. And we saw that there are several reasons, starting with overburdening participants when not needed. There can be a technology already available to do it smoother. Why would we overburden participants? Importance of using available technology to minimize the digital skill requirement. Maintaining trust towards the clinical trials. Maintaining data integrity. So these, I hope you had some time to absorb the slides. I will move on, but I found this a very interesting finding in the research. So the question around the diversity, of course, this is a very important topic. So our research doesn't directly address diversity in the data collection, but we use the data we collected to look at how we can leverage this data to make some educated guesses, let's say, about the diversity. So why Bart already mentioned why diversity is important. So I won't go over this again, but I will maybe highlight this one that based on some of the trials at home research as well, older adults are perceived as the vulnerable group for the increased digital literacy requirements in clinical trials. And currently, of course, we don't know, like I mentioned in the beginning, but we will now look how we can look at the data. So for now, I will talk about how about older adults and findings about this, about my implications. So I looked into the Eurostat 2021 data set on individuals' levels of digital skills, and I look at their assessment criteria, which is on the left, the categories, and I mapped all the skills. So they have a list of skills. It's a bit of a yes, no, and then you get certain levels. And when I did this with an imaginary person that has only the skills that we found in this trial, this amazing person would score in this profile. So above basic, these are the terms coming from the Eurostat data criterion itself. And when we look at this data, how many people in Europe has this profile or above? We see that 65% of the whole European population meets this profile. And 20% of the population lacks the required skills, or their skills couldn't be assessed due to lack of internet use in the last 3 months. So there is a potentially from this data, you could think 65% is easier to target and 20% is probably slightly out of reach. And of course, because older adults are more in the interest, when we look at the age group, we see that number of individuals lacking these skills in percentage is 49 for the age group 64 to 74. And this number drops to 27 in the age group 55 to 64. However, interestingly, if you stratify this data further into by education level, unfortunately you can do it only for the merged age group, you can see that the people with high education have much more like, maybe this is the confusing part. Let me explain a bit more clearly. 59% of the people were lacking the skill, and 9% of the highly educated were lacking the skills. So the number is quite dramatic. And if we look a bit on the literature as well, of course, this is not a comprehensive literature assessment, but we see that technology ownership is very critical in adoption of new digital tools for older adults. And we see that at least around 50% of the population in Europe, older population, are using technology like internet on a daily basis in most of the countries. And the same data is also shown in the OECD data. And we also concluded from this research that design of the tool, given instructions, and the meaningfulness to the patient group was also very critical in the adoption. And of course, not only the vulnerable groups are not only the elderly, although we talk about them the most sometimes. So if you look at the data, the digital literacy is affected by other parameters like education level, income level, and where people live, if they're living in the city or the rural areas. And on the side, you can see a small example how this may look like for education, high education or none to low education. And we also know that some socioeconomic factors may may act as a risk factor in some disease areas, and cardiovascular disease is one of the areas that are commonly referred here. And based on this, we can say that this effect we see on diversity, in the digital literacy may amplify the digital divide seen in a clinical trial population. So imagine if you're doing a cardiovascular disease clinical trial, maybe in the country, the digital divide isn't that big, but maybe the people who has this disease that you're looking into tend to be from these low education, low income, rural area group, then there is a higher chance that the digital literacy may be lower in your target group compared to the general outlook of the country you're doing your clinical trial in. So to conclude, strengths and limitations of the study. To our knowledge, this was the first study to identify the digital literacy, the competence requirements, and map these on DICOM framework. And the study revealed modular lists that can be tailored to specific trials. And we had a nice Delphi panel representing different stakeholder groups from the industry. On the limitation side, we could not include the soft digital literacy skills into this study because simply the measurement of this would require different tools. So it wasn't suitable to include. And rapidly evolving landscape may make some of the skills obsolete. So if we ever want to compare DCTs or clinical trials to a different area, such as just general healthcare, we may need to look if some of the things are already beyond us, some of the skill requirements. Maybe new technology has emerged by then. And lastly, more or less half of our panel members were from Trials at Home Consortium. This is a limitation, but at the same time, most of these people are on a daily basis working on decentralized clinical trials and also representing a variety of backgrounds. So to conclude, unfortunately, with this study results, it isn't possible to make a definitive conclusion on the impact of digital literacy requirements on the participant diversity. However, similar activities like this can help you identify potential vulnerable groups in your target population and help you bridge a possible digital divide in the planning of a clinical trial and inform your protocol. And lastly, this research can act as an awareness tool to minimize the digital literacy requirements in the design of hardware and software for DCTs. And lastly, to refer to the future research, right now, some more decentralized clinical trials are being done or planned. And it is important that we develop or use the ones that are already, or make better, improve the ones that are already accepted, develop and adopt standard tools to assess digital literacy. There are already some research about this, but it is important that we all use the same thing so that once we have some results, we can compare similar data sets to each other and see, okay, we measured the digital literacy in clinical trial A and B with the same tool, and we can see how the diversity is different, how they score differently in these tools. So it's important to assess not only the people's digital literacy, but also the digital literacy requirement of a clinical trial, so that in the future, once we have more data, we can compare this with a solid data set. I would like to thank you all, and if you have any time left, if I didn't talk much, Q&A.
Thank you, Parla. Great to see the presentation. We do have some questions that came in. So the first question that I want to ask you is actually from the audience, Parla. So is there a Digicom for staff involved in digital in DCTs? So what did you look at the competencies for the site personnel, and here home nurses are, for example, measured?
Very, very interesting question. Actually, DICCOMP is for any industry, and I know that this an association of nurses, I think. There was a care group, and the Carer Plus, I think, is the study's name. They tailored this framework for carers. However, for healthcare, that's the only example that I'm aware of. But the framework is built with tailoring in mind. So the idea is that you take that and then make it suitable for your own industry. And the carer is the only example that I know, and it's for, I think, the nurses. So I really recommend Googling on the Google Scholar. They have a few publishing papers about the findings.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that was made. We focus here on the participant, but of course the participant, for example, needs to be trained by someone.
Yes.
Sometimes. So then it also indeed for site, it's also there's also requirements that we should that can maybe follow up research.
I think that has to be also separate research, because I think we need a deeper dive in this for the carers, because there is a bit more implications, I think, for the site staff than it is for sometimes the participants.
And there's a question, how and where was the sample obtained, and was it reflecting of the population to be studied in radial? So maybe you can tell a little bit of where the sample was obtained, and then I can say how it would be reflective of radial or not.
Sample in sense of Delphi panel sample?
Yes, that's what I think you should talk to that. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually our study is only including industry professionals, because this is about the tools that are used. So we did not include any patients, so we don't have any patient sampling. Yeah, I guess, I don't know if we can compare this to a trial.
So indeed, we looked at, from a professional perspective, what we ask from participants if we are setting up decentralized clinical trials. But in this stage, we did not include the population yet. That is, for example, what we will be doing in Radial. Then we will be asking participants, what is your digital literacy? Well, not this literal, of course, but we have a questionnaire on digital literacy. And then we can later compare that between, for example, between the arms.
Yes.
I hope that answered the question. Then there's also a question on the 65% of the population would not meet digital requirements. And I think this was a bit of this is sort of extrapolation of your results, but this person would like to know how if you can elaborate a bit more. So in this case, we have our skills that are needed if you had a completely decentralized clinical trial, right?
Yes, so what we did here is that we looked at all the skills that we gathered and imagined a person that has all the skills we have listed, the ideal participant, if you like to call it like that, not necessarily an accurate term, honestly. And imagined this person filling in the survey for the Eurostat 2021 dataset that they went around asking people. And based on that, this profile on the left-hand side was created by us. And then the data set, then you can choose which ones in which level, and then you can see how many people fit to this criteria. And then 65% of the EU population, not stratified by age, did qualify at least this level, so also higher skills, but minimum this level of skills, 65% had it. What this exactly means, the 20 and 65%, the 20% based on this data does not have the skills that we need. 65% does have the skills we need, and anything in between might miss some of the skills and have some other of the skills. So that is the gray area where maybe a person is not very good at communication and collaboration skills, but maybe they're very good at information and data literacy, enough good for information and data literacy skills.
Okay.
Maybe this was...
Yeah, so I think it's good to mention that it was a sort of extra fictive exercise that we did. Like, if these are the skills that we have, how would our population be? And this, and do keep in mind, this is then for the whole of the data set that the Eurostat is from. So that includes all European countries. And you also see that there's quite a difference between countries there. Yes, indeed. So there's another question, if you included patient representatives in the study. I think we've already answered that a little bit, because in this study we focused on experts or professionals. But indeed, we have a patient representatives also in trials at home that we can consult on certain issues, and maybe it would be a nice next step. Is there a different way we work with a rural or an urban population? And I guess what the so maybe you can go to the slide where you... Yes, let me quickly move. So you mean maybe about how we can bridge this gap potentially? So here is more about the infrastructure. It's possible that in rural areas, there's the internet connections might be troublesome. So in this case, you might like to consider, for example, allowing mobile internet packages as part of the trial. This might be helpful. However, I think there are even places still in Europe that has low reception also for mobile phone. But it might still bridge the gap somewhat than none. I think that is one other than the other obvious, of course, intensive training, but that I think goes nowadays for when we talk about DCTs for every participant. So wouldn't be specific to rural. There's an interesting comment, actually not a question, from someone. He says, like, yes, but how to arrange that? And I must admit that also in radio, we've discussed this, but that's, yeah, there are some, there's some difficulties there, how you arrange a personal plan for someone in your trial. So that's indeed something that is a good suggestion, but how that would work out in the trial, that's indeed something that we still have to
Yeah, honestly, that is a little bit difficult in the operations indeed. And yeah, honestly, we can of course try bridging, and that's not necessarily like I say it here, but it's not necessarily implying it is very easy, just like that. But maybe what we also need to realize at some point that it is also very difficult for these people to travel on and off from their home, from far away from city, or maybe from your clinical trial all the time. So in that sense, like sometimes maybe we also need to look at the winnings. Of course, we want to include everyone, but this is completely personal opinion, but I think it is likely that we cannot include everyone 100%.
Yeah, I think there's another question here in the chat, and it's based on your analysis. Do you feel that you would actually, well, I interpret the question like this. So that you maybe the population at risk is actually similar in a conventional and a decentralized trial, because you say, for example, about socioeconomic status and everything, that's also problems we see in conventional trials. And I think that's indeed something that we have to keep in mind. I think it's also a nice question to end with, because but maybe there are things in designing a DCT that we can from the start already think about, so that we sort of by design can have more diverse and inclusive trials, rather than sort of trying to fix it in the end. So I think that's a nice question to
something
leave. Yeah.
I would like to add to that is decentralization is not only nowadays a question for only clinical trials, but also healthcare itself. When I was doing this research, one of the interesting papers that I came across, which actually had been a very important reference in the discussion of this research, was actually not about clinical trials at all. It was about, I think, neurology doctors, because most of the elderly people also needs access to neurology professionals, which isn't very common apparently everywhere. So they set remote connection clinics for this old elderly population. For example, this can be in your GP, but they facilitate a room for you with a connection and a video. Or, you know, another options we heard is like the car comes by you, but also it can be more locally. And of course, it still comes with operational challenges, because somebody has to be there at the GP to still help, and they're also very busy. But this is not only a challenge in clinical trials, but this is a challenge we collectively have to address at some point also in healthcare, because these people also just sometimes have challenges to receive the daily or at least frequent healthcare that they need.
Yeah, so indeed, healthcare is also moving towards more digital means.
Yeah, so I wouldn't look at this problem or the question here only as a DCT. Of course, we are now looking from the perspective as trials at home at this point, but most of the questions raised here is valid for healthcare as well, and numbers as well. Because a person living in rural areas have also difficulty accessing maybe a good healthcare professionals at a monthly level maybe.
People are agreeing with you in the Q&A, so that's good. Parla, I would like to thank you a lot for your presentation. If there's any questions, please reach out, and they're not answered, please reach out to us via Trials at Home. And so, Parla, thank you again. Thanks everybody for coming, and I hope to see you all at the next Trials at Home webinar or anywhere else in the near future.
Thank you, everyone. I hope this was a very good time for you as well as it was for me. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.